It was a cold evening when the call came in. The wind howled down Maple Avenue, rattling the windows of the old squad car I was driving. My partner, Sarah Lee, sat next to me, her expression as unreadable as usual, though I could tell she was weary. We had just finished a string of routine calls, nothing too exciting, when the 911 dispatch came through. A child in distress. That's all it said, send help, please. Then the line went dead. I gripped the steering wheel harder. A child. The panic that set in wasn't like anything I'd ever felt in the years I'd been on the force. Maybe it was because I had a son of my own. Or maybe it was just the pure, innocent urgency that seemed to hang in the air when a child needed help. I shifted the car into gear and sped down the road, the lights of the squad car flickering through the dark as we headed towards Sycamore Street. We arrived at the address within minutes. The house, if you could call it that, looked abandoned. A dilapidated, two-story structure that had seen better days. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that seemed to swallow up the old tricycle and the scattering of toys lying in the grass. It was almost as if the house had been forgotten by the world. But there was something about the toys, the tricycle, the doll left face down in the dirt, that screamed of recent life. I looked at Sarah, who had already unstrapped her seatbelt and was reaching for her weapon. We didn't know what we were walking into. All we knew was that there was a child in need. And every second counted. We approached the front door cautiously. There was no sound coming from inside. No movement. The house felt eerily still. But I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I knocked sharply. No answer. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. I pushed the door open with a force I didn't realize I had in me, the hinges creaking as we stepped inside. The smell hit us immediately, something sharp, chemical, and wrong. The place had the unmistakable stench of decay and neglect. It wasn't just dust and old furniture, it was a squalid, run-down environment where the walls seemed to close in on us with their filth. Empty beer cans and discarded needles littered the floor. I could see the remnants of drug use, paraphernalia scattered haphazardly across the room. My stomach turned at the sight, and I felt a surge of anger. Where was the child? I signaled to Sarah to clear the house. We moved through the rooms cautiously, checking every corner, every closet. The house had been left in a rush, drawers were open, clothes thrown about carelessly, but still, no sign of the child. I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. What kind of monster would leave a child in a place like this? We reached the staircase that led to the second floor. I didn't say anything, but Sarah's eyes met mine. We both knew. The child had to be upstairs. My heart hammered in my chest as I climbed the stairs, trying to ignore the creeping dread that settled over me. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the creaking of the floorboards beneath our boots. I froze when I heard it, a faint, distant cry. It wasn't a loud cry, but it was unmistakable. A child. The sound of distress. Up there, I whispered to Sarah, pointing to the second door at the end of the hallway. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as we moved toward it. The door was locked. Stand back, Sarah said, taking a step back to kick it in. The door flew open with a resounding crash, and what we found inside was like something out of a nightmare. The room was small and dark, with no furniture except for an old, rusted radiator against the far wall. And there, chained to it, was a young boy, barely more than a skeleton of a child. His small frame covered in bruises and his clothes ragged. His eyes were wide with fear. But when he saw us, something shifted in his expression. He didn't scream or try to run. Instead, he weakly lifted his head, his eyes locking onto mine. It was Jake, my son. The shock hit me like a physical blow. My breath caught in my chest as I stared at him, chained and helpless, barely able to recognize the thin, pale child before me. His skin was almost translucent, and I could count every rib on his body. His face was bruised, swollen, his once bright eyes now dull and hollow. Jake. I whispered, my voice cracking. The name came out like a prayer, a plea for some semblance of the boy I once knew. He blinked. A faint, fragile smile tugging at his lips. But the effort seemed to drain him. Dad, he whispered. His voice weak, but clear enough for me to hear. My heart shattered in that moment. But I couldn't allow myself to break. Not now. Not when he needed me the most. I reached forward and gently unchained him, lifting him into my arms as if he weighed nothing at all. He was so light, too light. It was as though he had vanished into nothing but skin and bone. Don't worry, son, I whispered, my voice breaking as I held him close. I've got you. You're safe now. The anger, the confusion, the guilt all surged through me in waves. How had I let this happen? How had I let my son fall into such a place? In the hands of those who could do this to him? But for now, all that mattered was that I was here. I would never let him go again. I would never let anyone hurt him again. As we made our way back down the stairs, I promised myself one thing above all else: I would make things right. The sound of sirens filled the air as the paramedics arrived, their faces grim as they assessed Jake's condition. Every movement I made felt surreal, like I was moving through a haze. Unable to fully grasp the reality of what had just happened. I had found my son, chained and broken, in that horrible room. But now, as they carefully lifted him onto the stretcher, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't doing enough. The anger that had begun to build inside me shifted into a sharp ache, a deep sorrow for all the time I had lost with Jake. The paramedics worked quickly, administering fluids and oxygen as they loaded Jake into the ambulance. I climbed in beside him, refusing to leave his side, despite the steady stream of professionals swarming around us. Sarah had already called for backup, and now, I was consumed by the thought of getting my son the care he needed. As the ambulance sped through the streets, I sat next to Jake, holding his frail hand in mine, trying to offer him some semblance of comfort. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, and for a moment, I allowed myself to slip into a quiet despair. I had failed him. The guilt was unbearable. For the past 2 years, I had been caught up in the mess of my divorce from Emma, too wrapped up in the pain and bitterness of losing my family to notice what was happening to Jake. I'd fought for custody. Sure, but what had that custody really meant if I wasn't there for him when he needed me most? How could I have let Emma, of all people, be the one to raise him in such a toxic environment? I'd been distant. I hadn't called enough. Hadn't visited enough. I had let my frustrations with Emma cloud my judgment. And now, I was paying the price. I wasn't the father Jake needed. And the consequences were sitting right in front of me. Weak and broken on a stretcher. The ambulance swerved to a stop outside the emergency entrance of the hospital. And I leapt out, holding Jake's hand as the medical team rushed to take him into the trauma unit. The hospital was filled with activity, doctors moving quickly, nurses directing them, all of them trying to stabilize Jake. I watched helplessly from the corner of the room, feeling utterly useless. I couldn't even look at him without feeling my chest tighten. The boy I had known, his laugh, his energy, was gone. In its place was this sickly version of him, with hollow eyes and a body that looked as though it had been drained of all life. I felt the tears sting my eyes, but I forced them back. I couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Not when I needed to be strong for Jake. Mr. Johnson, a voice broke through my thoughts, and I turned to see a doctor approaching. She was a woman in her 40s, with dark brown hair pulled back into a neat ponytail and a concerned look in her eyes. Your son's condition is critical. He's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and there are signs of multiple infections. We're doing everything we can, but we need to be cautious. It's a very delicate situation. The words felt like a punch to my gut. I had known Jake had been suffering, but hearing it in such clinical terms, seeing the reality of it laid out in front of me, was more than I could handle. Will he be okay? I asked. my voice barely above a whisper. The question felt foolish as soon as it left my mouth. How could she possibly know? The doctor gave me a sympathetic look. We're doing our best. But there are a lot of factors to consider. His body is weak. We need to get him stabilized first before we can determine the full extent of his injuries. I nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on my shoulders. But I wouldn't leave him. Not for anything. As the doctors and nurses worked around me, I stayed by Jake's side, holding his hand, whispering to him that everything was going to be okay. It felt like an empty promise. But I had to say it. He needed to hear it. The hours passed in a blur. The staff were constantly in and out, monitoring his vitals, adjusting the fours, administering medications. I couldn't focus on anything except Jake. My mind kept replaying the moment I found him chained to that radiator, his body emaciated and broken. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again. The pain in his eyes as he recognized me. "Dad," he had said. I had barely recognized him. And yet he had still known me. I couldn't understand how Emma had let this happen. How she had let it get this far. But then again, the drugs, the late nights, the spiral into her own darkness, maybe it wasn't so hard to understand after all. I had watched her change over the years. Seen the way she had drifted further and further away from the person I had once loved. I had tried to make it work for Jake's sake. But she hadn't. And now, here we were. The nurses had finished their assessments. And they began to prepare Jake for a transfer to a different ward where he could receive specialized care. The journey ahead would be long. And I couldn't predict what the outcome would be. But one thing I knew for sure, I was never going to leave his side again. I promised myself that. For the first time in years, I felt clear-headed. There was only one thing that mattered now, Jake's recovery. And I would do whatever it took to help him heal. The next few days were a blur. Time seemed to stretch and fold in on itself as I sat by Jake's bedside, watching him fight to stay alive. His condition was still critical. But every small improvement, each breath that came a little easier, each slight flicker of recognition in his eyes, gave me a sliver of hope. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic. But I could see the weariness in their faces. The understanding that Jake had a long, difficult road ahead. And so did I. I stayed by his side day and night. Even as Sarah kept me updated on the investigation. Emma and her boyfriend Craig had been arrested. But that knowledge did little to ease the anger gnawing at me. It wasn't enough to just have them locked away. It wasn't enough to make up for the years of pain Jake had endured. What kind of mother would let this happen? What kind of man could hurt a child? Let alone leave him to suffer in such a horrific way. The guilt inside me twisted and turned. Relentless. I couldn't stop asking myself why I hadn't seen the signs earlier. When I had received those first few calls from Jake, the ones where his voice sounded so small and distant. Why hadn't I paid closer attention? Why hadn't I checked on him sooner? Why hadn't I been there when he needed me the most? Every time I looked at Jake, his frail body hooked up to fours and oxygen, I saw all the mistakes I had made. The years I had spent lost in the mess of my divorce. The hours I had spent arguing with Emma, focusing on everything else but Jake's needs. I had been selfish. I had been distracted. And now, my son was paying the price. But there was no time for self-pity. Jake needed me now more than ever. And I wasn't going to fail him again. I watched him sleep. His face pale and drawn. His breathing labored but steady. There were moments when I thought I saw a flicker of the old Jake, the mischievous glint in his eye. The hint of a smile on his lips, but they were fleeting. He was so far from the happy, energetic child I remembered. The boy who used to run into my arms after school. The boy who loved to build forts out of blankets and jump into puddles on rainy days. The weight of those memories crushed me. But I had to push them aside. I had to focus on what was right in front of me. I had to focus on Jake's recovery. The first few times he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. The words so faint I had to lean in close to hear him. Dad, he said once, his eyes fluttering open. I'm sorry. The words sliced through me like a knife. Sorry? Jake was sorry? He had nothing to apologize for. He had been the one suffering all along. And yet he was the one apologizing to me. I squeezed his hand, trying to keep my emotions in check. No, Jake, I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. You don't need to say sorry. You've done nothing wrong. I'm the one who should be sorry. But Jake was already drifting back into unconsciousness, his fragile form still struggling to heal. Days blended into one another as the hospital staff did everything they could to stabilize him. They were hopeful. But there was no telling what lasting effects the abuse had left on him, mentally, physically, emotionally. The doctor had warned me that Jake might never fully recover. The trauma he had endured could leave scars that would take years, if not a lifetime, to heal. But in that moment, I didn't care about what the doctors said. I didn't care about the odds. All I cared about was getting my son back. The hospital room, which had felt so cold and sterile when I first arrived, began to feel like a sanctuary. I spent hours by Jake's side, talking to him, telling him stories of when he was younger, of the time we went to the beach and he spent the whole day building sandcastles, of the time he dressed up as a superhero for Halloween and insisted on saving everyone from imaginary villains. I spoke to him as if he could hear me, as if he could feel the love I had for him. Even in the deepest, darkest corners of his pain, there were moments of silence, where I just sat there, holding his hand, feeling helpless and lost. But there was one thing I knew for certain: I would never leave him. Not again. Whatever the future held, we would face it together. And I would fight. Not just for his survival, but for his healing, his happiness, and his future. I swore to myself that I would make things right. I would be the father Jake deserved. This was just the beginning. The days at the hospital felt both endless and fleeting, as if time itself had stretched into something foreign. Nate, I should say, had been unconscious for most of the time I spent by his side. I still couldn't wrap my mind around it. The name change was symbolic of how much had been lost and how much needed to be rebuilt. But as the days wore on, I found myself learning his small gestures. The way his hand squeezed mine when he was waking up. The slight furrow of his brow when a nightmare seemed to stir in his sleep. The doctors had warned me that the damage was severe. The malnutrition, the infections, the broken bones, all of it had taken its toll on his frail body. They told me that, physically, Nate was likely to survive. But emotionally, the path ahead was much murkier. Trauma this deep didn't just go away with the passage of time. I couldn't stop thinking about those long nights alone, wondering where my son was, why I wasn't there for him. The guilt was suffocating. I had always thought that time would heal things between me and Nate, that the estrangement from my ex-wife and our messy divorce had caused the distance. But the truth, when it hit me like a freight train, was so much harder to bear. I hadn't just been distant, I had abandoned him in the most crucial way. I had let a child, my son, fall through the cracks. In the quiet moments when Nate was still asleep, I would go outside, breathe in the air, and try to force myself to think clearly, to remind myself that this wasn't just about me. It was about Nate, his recovery, his future. On the fourth day, when the light began to change in the early evening, something shifted. I was sitting by Nate's bed when he stirred. His hand twitched in mine, and slowly, his eyes fluttered open. At first, he didn't seem to recognize me. His gaze was confused, fogged over by pain and fear. Then, as if by instinct, his hand squeezed mine, and his lips parted as if trying to form words. "Dad," he whispered, his voice fragile, raw. The word seemed to float in the room between us. It felt like the most beautiful sound in the world, like a lifeline to something I hadn't realized I was so desperately searching for. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, trying not to break. "It's me. It's Dad." For a moment, I was terrified that he wouldn't remember me, that his mind would be too far gone, fractured by the abuse. But then I saw something shift in his eyes. Recognition. But it was weak, like a flickering flame in a dark room, struggling to stay alive. Nate blinked slowly, and his lips parted again, this time to ask, "What happened?" His voice trembled as if the weight of it was too much. I swallowed hard, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. It was hard enough to see him like this, but harder still to think that this was all a result of people who were supposed to protect him. His mother. His stepfather. They hurt you, Nate. I said quietly. But you're safe now. I'm here. No one will hurt you again. I promise. He seemed to process my words, his face crumpling slightly as a tear fell down his cheek. I reached out and wiped it away with my thumb, trying to push the guilt away, trying to be the father he needed. "Are you mad at me?" he whispered after a long pause, his voice tiny, almost childlike. My heart broke. "No, Nate," I said quickly. "Never. I'm just so sorry I wasn't here for you. I'm sorry I let this happen." He closed his eyes for a moment, like he was trying to take in everything I had said. When his eyes opened again, he looked at me as if he was seeing me for the first time. "You'll stay with me now, won't you?" "I'm not going anywhere," I promised, squeezing his hand tighter. There was silence for a long moment, both of us unsure of where to go next. The room felt heavy with unspoken words. But there was one thing I knew for certain: we would take it one step at a time. Nate's healing, physically and emotionally, would take time. But for the first time in a long while, I felt something like hope stirring within me. I didn't know how we would get through this, or what the future would look like. But I knew we would get through it together. I had failed him in the past, but I wouldn't fail him again. Not now. Not ever. As the hours passed and Nate drifted back to sleep, I stayed by his side, the weight of the future pressing heavily on my chest. There was so much to do, so many pieces of our broken lives to pick up. But in this moment, with his small hand in mine, I finally believed that we had a chance. The days that followed were filled with police updates and constant visits from the hospital staff. But there was something I couldn't shake, a gnawing emptiness that followed me wherever I went. Nate was getting stronger, his body beginning to respond to the care he was receiving. But the mental and emotional wounds were still raw. I couldn't help but think about the people responsible for what he had endured. When I was told that Sarah and her boyfriend, Craig, had been arrested, it hit me harder than I expected. I had expected anger, yes, but not this overwhelming sense of betrayal. I had known Sarah for years. She was the mother of my child, the woman I had once loved. We had our differences, of course, but I never imagined she could let something like this happen. But as the police investigation unfolded, everything I had believed about our family, about her, started to crack apart. Sarah had always struggled, yes, with her own demons. But this was beyond anything I had ever imagined. Craig, the man she had chosen to be with, turned out to be a nightmare in human form. He was the one who had locked Nate away in that room, who had ignored the child's cries for help. When the police spoke to him, he admitted it without remorse, stating that Nate had become a burden. My blood boiled at the words. But it was Sarah's involvement that truly shattered me. Through the questioning, it became clear that Sarah had been too far gone into her addiction to care. She had allowed Craig to manipulate her, had turned a blind eye to the suffering of her own son. She had failed him, betrayed him in the worst possible way. I kept asking myself how it was possible. How could a mother do that to her child? I had known Sarah for so long. I had watched her fall apart slowly over the years. But I had never thought it would come to this. We had fought. Sure, we had our differences. But we had both shared a love for Nate. Or so I thought. What had happened to that love? What had happened to the woman I had once believed in? In my anger and confusion, I reached out to my lawyer to discuss the next steps in the custody battle. I was determined now more than ever to fight for Nate. The thought of him ever being returned to Sarah's care, or living in any environment where he wasn't protected, was too much to bear. I had to be the one to keep him safe. But even as I prepared myself for the battle ahead, the overwhelming emotions of betrayal and guilt began to seep through. I couldn't help but wonder how I had failed Sarah too. We had both let things go too far, she with her addiction, and me with my distance. I could have tried harder to reach out to her, to help her before it got to this point. But hindsight, as they say, is always clearer than the present. Nate had always loved his mother. Despite everything, he had always longed for her approval, for her affection, even when she was distant, even when her behavior was unpredictable. And now, as I sat by his bedside, hearing him call for her in his sleep, I realized the depth of the damage that had been done. It wasn't just physical pain he had suffered, it was the destruction of the trust and the bond between a mother and her son. I couldn't erase what had happened to him. I couldn't undo the years of neglect and pain. But I could promise him something, that I would be there. I would always be there. No matter what. In the quiet moments of reflection, I felt a deep sorrow for the family I had once dreamed of. The family that had been shattered by our failures, by addiction, by the darkness that had crept into our lives. But I also knew that I had a chance to rebuild with Nate. We could start over. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to heal. But the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. And the first step in that journey was holding on to the love we still shared. The days in the hospital turned into weeks. And the weeks blurred together as I watched Nate slowly heal, both physically and emotionally. His body, though battered and frail, was recovering with the help of the dedicated medical team. Yet it was the emotional scars that seemed to linger. Those invisible wounds that had cut so deeply, leaving marks I knew would take years to fully heal. But we had time. We had the chance to rebuild, to heal, and to find our way back to each other. I had vowed to be there for him, no matter what. This would be the beginning of something new. We would start again. A father and son, no longer separated by the mistakes of the past. Nate's recovery was slow but steady. He had his good days. Days where his laughter would briefly return. And he'd start talking about the things he loved, his favorite cartoons. The games he used to play with his friends before everything fell apart. But there were darker days, too. Days when the memories of what he had suffered would surface. And he'd fall into silence. His eyes clouded with pain. I could see it in the way he would flinch when someone touched him too suddenly. The way he recoiled at loud noises or unexpected movements. I could see the deep, hidden fear that still haunted him. The fear of being hurt again. On those days, I stayed close. I never pushed him. I let him know, with quiet words and a steady presence, that I was there to stay. I knew the road ahead would be full of setbacks, of moments where we would both stumble and fall. But I also knew that we were both stronger than we had been before. I visited Nate every day, even when the hospital staff encouraged me to take breaks. I didn't need a break. I needed to be there, by his side, showing him that this time, I wasn't going anywhere. Each moment, each small step forward was a victory, and I wouldn't let it slip away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, the doctors gave me the news I had been praying for. Nate was strong enough to leave the hospital. He wasn't fully healed. Of course, he still had a long road to travel, but he was out of danger. And that, to me, was all that mattered. We packed up his things, and I drove him home, back to our new life, away from the sterile hospital walls that had, in some ways, kept us safe but also trapped us in the past. As we pulled up to the house, I could see the hesitance in Nate's eyes. It was a new home for him, a place where he would learn to feel safe again. I knew that was going to take time. It would take time for him to adjust, to feel like he truly belonged here. But I was determined to make it work. This house, though modest, was ours. We would fill it with love, with laughter, and with a sense of security that Nate had never truly known before. The past was heavy, but it was not our future. We would create a new story together. As we sat down in the living room, just the two of us, I looked at Nate and promised him again, this time with all the sincerity I could muster, I will never leave you. We're in this together. I'm not going anywhere. Nate didn't respond immediately, but his hand, which had been trembling a moment ago, now settled comfortably in mine. He looked at me, his eyes still uncertain. But there was something else there now, something softer. Something that reminded me of the boy I had once known. I'm scared, Dad, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I know you are, I replied gently. And that's okay. But we're going to take it one step at a time. Together. And together. We would rebuild. The road would be long. And the scars would remain. But I believed now, really believed, that we could heal. We could start again. We could have the life that we deserved. And as I looked at my son, finally free of the horrors that had defined his life for too long, I knew that no matter what came next, we would face it side by side. Our new beginning had already started.